Nostalgia is a tricky mistress. It imposes itself upon our opinions, and I've not seen too many retrospective reviews without a good dose of it, especially here on YouTube. I find almost all reviews of entertainment to be subjective anyways, so it can come off as pretentious for an individual to plaster something with the label objectively good or bad. In my opinion, entertainment is meant to engage us on a primal level, so taking the reviewer's humanity out of a review makes it dull and lifeless. I see nothing wrong in letting those biases show and calling them for what they are, as that personal brand of enthusiasm or distaste is often what makes that review worth watching. Agent Under Fire holds no great prominent position within the world of video games. It's by no means the most impressive shooter, even for its day. It's not particularly influential on later Bond games or the industry itself, and while some contemporary reviews were kind to this game, others found it pretty superfluous, and it was even nominated for a Most Disappointing Game award of the time, losing out to Luigi's Mansion. Simply put, I know this is not considered the best Bond game, nor is it a great replication of the film series, nor does it have the best campaign or multiplayer. However, there are few games that scratch the itch I have for a bombastic Bond adventure quite like Agent Under Fire. And it feels appropriate to be tackling this game now because later this year, we'll be celebrating its silver anniversary. That's right, it's been 25 years since this game's release, and I feel old just thinking about that. Agent Under Fire rather infamously started as a PS2 and PC version of The World Is Not Enough. However, it was felt that too much time had elapsed to take advantage of Twine's release, since Bond 20, as it was known at the time, was just beginning production, and by the time this game came out, we were gearing up to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the series. Thus, the game was delayed so it could be retooled. One rumored consideration was to have Roger Moore reprise the role, but instead, an entirely new adventure was conceived with an original James Bond model and voice. The developers felt they would have more creative freedom and license to craft set pieces and scenarios more suitable for a video game than if they had adapted one of the films, and they got excited by the prospect. That enthusiasm must have helped immensely, as this restructure was announced in April 2001 following a delay announcement in February, with the first release being in November. The game was first released for the PlayStation 2, with GameCube and Xbox versions coming the following year. My first exposure to the game was late 2004. After becoming a Bond fan in July of that year, I sought out some of the more recent games. My eye was on Nightfire, given that I had played it before at my sister's house. However, I saw both it and Agent Under Fire on sale for $20 at my local store. Given my limited funds, I could only get one, and I flipped a coin right there. I think I knew Agent Under Fire came first, but given that the film series mostly consisted of standalone adventures, I had the impression the games would be the same. That decision turned out to be fortuitous, since Nightfire features the return of Zoe Nightshade and was certainly an evolution on this game's mechanics. I fell head over heels for the game and pretty much went through it with a fine-tooth comb before I got to the subsequent entries. To this day, I go through several 6th generation EA Bond games about once a year marathon style, and Agent Under Fire is always where I start. While visiting Hong Kong, James Bond is asked by MI6 to respond to a distress call. A CIA agent has been caught infiltrating Identicon, a company rumored to be a front for illegal activities. The agent, Zoe Nightshade, was to retrieve a suspicious briefcase of vials. Bond infiltrates the facility, grabs the briefcase, and rescues Zoe, but not before alerting the guards. The pair escape through the streets, fending off pursuing attackers and retrieve a second briefcase of vials from another site. They meet up with R at the docks, but then a mercenary named Carla the Jackal pulls up, shoots a rocket at them, killing Zoe, and steals back one of the briefcases. Bond follows in his gadget-laden BMW Z8. While Carla is nowhere to be found, Bond does accomplish his mission and recovers the vials. The contents of the 9 vials are later analyzed, with 8 belonging to various world leaders. The last is marked Griffin, referring to a man named Reginald Griffin. Griffin is a British diplomat working out of the embassy in Romania, who is obsessed with protecting a secure room within the embassy. Bond investigates the place and finds Griffin's dead body and an identical man guarding it. After defeating the guard, Bond finds information implicating Malprave Industries, a Swiss-based enterprise and the parent company of Identicon. What's more disturbing is that the guard is confirmed to be an exact genetic duplicate of Griffith. With one of the largest corporations in the world confirmed to be developing human clones, and with the DNA of various world leaders, Bond will have to work fast to prevent Malprave Industries from achieving world domination. The plot is sufficiently Bondian enough to make for a decent through line of a game, though it's too underdeveloped to make for a captivating story, and the cast isn't that particularly strong. Later games would improve upon these aspects, but to its credit, it's clear that Agent Under Fire is more concerned with its gameplay than it is in the connecting tissue, which I think is more important for a video game. But what I like about the story is that it feels appropriate for the Bond series at the time. Given that Die Another Day would deal in rewriting DNA, cloning doesn't feel that far off for the Brosnan period. And it works well enough to string together the levels, even if I feel like the connecting tissue is almost as flimsy as the investigation was in the Moonraker film. But there are a couple of missed opportunities I can't help but point out. Number one, the story does have several clones playing a part in the narrative, yet I don't think it takes advantage of making Bond question who might or might not be on his side enough. There's one moment with the real Nightshade, but I wish the story could have worked more moments like this throughout. It would have helped give the game a great atmosphere of suspense to make it stand out from the other Bond titles, and would have gone a long way to making this feel like a legitimate cinematic adventure. Number two, video games are fond of mirror matches. It would have been neat to see a Bond versus Bond scenario at some point. As a hypothetical exercise, wouldn't it have been fun if you couldn't shoot your way out of the fight and instead had to make an ingenious use of your gadgets to outwit your opponent? But I understand the developers were in a time crunch and had to make do with what they had, and either these things weren't possible within that time frame, or they might have felt what they had was good enough and the ideas didn't occur to them. Remember, no one expected much from licensed games at the time, certainly not Bond games. There are obviously remnants of that earlier design period when this game was supposed to be a version of The World Is Not Enough. Some of the computer graphics share images from the film, such as the rig that travels down the pipeline, or this map of the Black Sea region. Some of the weapons are lifted straight from those earlier games, like the Wolfram P2K. Some of the music is original, but there are a number of borrowed tracks, like the score playing over the final block fight, and if you listen closely to some of them, you can hear themes from Twine throughout, especially the main melody. Some of the characters also suspiciously have some film counterparts, like Malprave and Block. I also thought the first guy you see with the vials looked like Lachaise, and Carla the Jackal reminds me of Cigar Girl if you broadly describe their characters. Some of these levels could have even been reusing assets from planned Twine levels. I could easily see some of the stuff in the oil rig used for the Caviar Factory. The tube chase in Forbidden Depths reminds me of the pipeline chase. The Embassy has similar vibes in its construction to the Swiss Bank and MI6 levels. And the submarine at the beginning, complete with a woman that you need to rescue, could very well have been used for that game's finale. Now, I'm not citing these as detriments. Rather, I think it makes for a fun Easter egg game throughout, and the final result is suitably different enough that I'm not bogged down in the comparisons. I'm actually quite impressed with the ingenuity of the reused assets. Like I said, the main focus of the game is the gameplay, and by golly, they've got it down. I don't know if this is an unpopular opinion within the fandom, but I struggle to think of an outright terrible campaign level here. Granted, not everything in them is stellar, but a lot of Bond games have sections that I dread replaying, like the stealth section from The World's Not Enough N64 edition, or the Hoover Dam from Rogue Agent. Indeed, some of these levels are the best we've seen from the Bond games, and I always have a blast on replays. We begin with Trouble in Paradise, and right away we're given a couple of different ways into this building. You can use your Q decryptor on the door, or the Q grapple to go through the roof. Having different paths in a game really makes me feel like Bond, as I have to make a choice based on what I think would be best. For example, entering through the door will not prevent you from completing the level, but going through the roof allows you to take out a guard silently and grab a key card to access an armory vault. The game rewards you for being observant and de-escalating situations. For example, some guards are beneath boxes that you can shoot at to fall on top of them. Or some guards may be by gas nozzles that you can shoot and the gas will take them out instantly. Most of the rest of the level is pretty straightforward, giving you chances to test out some gadgets and get a feel for the controls. There's even a cool section where you get into a shootout in a darkened room, showing off the power of the 6th generation consoles. The final area has you work your way around the submarine pen to rescue Zoe. I love the whole vibe of this area and how grand it looks. It really feels like a set-piece stage from one of the films. The next level introduces the on-rails segments. I'm kinda sad this style of level has largely gone by the wayside these days in action games. I get it, they might not be as exciting to players as they can be relatively easy to go through, all you're doing is shooting. But I feel all games benefit from a variety of gameplay styles and level designs, and Bond fending off guards from outside a moving vehicle is a very Bond thing to do. Plus, shooting out tires and explosive barrels adds to the challenge of the levels and makes them great for replays. The third level, Dangerous Pursuit, is pretty short, but it introduces the driving mechanics into the campaign. In my opinion, Bond video games have never done this element better since. The vehicles are easy to get a handle on, and the 2 levels are incredibly open and give you plenty of opportunity to discover their secrets. And there are a few things that are going to make you feel more like 007 than driving a gadget-laden car in a great chase. Bad Diplomacy is next up and uses enforced stealth gameplay. You might think I'd hate this, given my harsh reaction to the idea in the N64 Twine, but actually I adore this level. The embassy is a great place to explore. The guards are easy to make out, it's fairly clear when they can spot you, and I love the trip lasers and how you can disable them if you open a panel next to them and cut the wires. Going around doing proper covert spy work is one of the things I want in a Bond video game, and this is a great example of that. Plus, you get a nice bit where James meets our main villain without realizing it. It's appropriately Bondian, particularly of the Roger Moore era. My only real wish is that you had just a little more time to take out the guards before they sound the alarm. These guys are quick! We then head to the Swiss Alps for Cold Reception, another twist on being a proper spy here. You can indeed go in guns blazing, but if you take your time to be stealthy, you can avoid most of the firefights. For example, picking up this inconspicuous keycard and using it at a computer will disable the alarms, which would have sounded anew every time you accessed the computer mainframes with your phone. I also love the progression of this level. We start in a nice office, go within the mountain to see some of the deeper parts of the base, and we end with Bond using the tram cable hook to escape. Very Majesties-esque. Night of the Jackal takes us back to Romania to prevent malpraised men from kidnapping Dr. Natalia Demescu, a former employee of the company who has a data chip with information on something known as Poseidon. We start a battle outside the gates of the embassy, and because the bus blocked the gates, we now have to find an alternate route inside. I love how you can make this opening easier or harder on yourself. If you avoid shooting the guards attacking the building, they'll ignore you. There are also a few snipers in the area, and you'll need to be careful and exploit some covers to subdue them. One of my favorite moments of the game happens right afterwards. When you grapple up to R's safe house, you walk in on a girl taking a shower, which turns out to be a holographic projection. I played this game quite a bit when I was going through puberty. Something about the design of most of these women really rubbed me up the right way. But the shower scene was the cream of the crop, and I won't deny this is one I replayed a lot. There are no actual nipples on the character model, and you can't really see the other area, but in combination with the amazingly cool level music, I stayed at this section maybe longer than I should admit. Anyways, getting back on track here, you are given a keycard to go into the embassy through a side door. You then rescue some hostages before running back through some areas from Bad Diplomacy. Both of the subsequent games had levels that had you return to earlier environments and new scenarios. I don't know that this was really called for, but it helps the game feel more like the films, as Bond would sometimes return to certain areas during his missions, like the Monsoon Palace in Octopussy, or Piz Gloria in Majesties. It's a small touch that I love. The level has a great ending, with you running into Carla the Jackal. She can be one of the more bullet-spongy enemies, but if you think like Bond, this fight will be quite easy. There's a switch over to the side that'll allow you to drop Carla into a fan and get spliced up. It's a pretty gruesome end for the character, but Bond suitably makes a quip which pacifies me immediately. And there's a surprise helicopter battle at the end. Honestly, I only attack the helicopter with machine gun emplacements on the harder difficulties. When I can afford to take the hits, I stay in one place, use my sniper to shoot the pilot, and take the helicopter down with a single shot. If this ain't Bond-like, I don't know what is. Following this, we get the second and unfortunately last driving level of the game. Given the short development cycle, 12 levels makes sense, and previous EA Bond games had about the same number of levels. But it does mean the game is all too brief and can be completed in about 2 hours if you plow through it. Yet this level, Streets of Bucharest, is so wonderfully over the top that it becomes one of my go-to levels on replays. Bond gets into a DB5 to find the missing data chip, and I adore driving around the place, using missiles and Q-slicks to my advantage. This is my preferred of the two driving levels, but the real reason I love this level is something I'm going to praise later on. The level consists of 2 segments, and the DB5 is only part 1. Part 2 has you do an on-rails tanks section. I always love using a tank in these games, and I do enjoy having another on-rails segment. And there's some great variety and pacing to the level. You go from simple cars to armored trucks to helicopters, and there's even a section where you must engage night vision goggles to progress. Now seems to be a good time to talk about replayability. A lot of Bond games calculate a final score for you, consisting of the usuals of how long it took to complete the level, how many enemies did you kill, weapon accuracy and efficiency, and so on. The incentive here is to get a gold or platinum medal, which grants you rewards. The gold medal gives you campaign rewards, whereas the platinum is for multiplayer. This might be one of the only times where I prefer the gold rewards. For example, the final level grants you unlimited P2K ammo, whereas the multiplayer reward is just a skin. For this level, you get to use the Lotus Esprit for the driving levels. This is such a great idea, and the Lotus actually plays differently and is not just a vehicle skin. It's faster and turns more easily. However, unless you turn off the gold rewards in the options, you are forced to use the Lotus. I'd like the option to select between the cars at the start. Also, I hate how you either have to have all the gold rewards or none of them. I'd love to mix and match if I could. Finally, I noticed that the Lotus's machine guns are a little different to the others. When you slow down with the cars, the guns hit the road instead of continuing to go outward. That's all well and good, but because of the smaller chassis of the Lotus, I feel the guns hit the pavement sooner than the others. This might just be a me thing, but it becomes bothersome when I use the Lotus on Dangerous Pursuit and try to get the opening Bond move without a rocket. I also haven't talked about Bond moves in 007 tokens. Bond moves were pretty standard for the 6th generation Bond games and are rewarded for certain tasks that feel appropriately Bondian. Sometimes these are just for playing the level normally, and others are for extra tasks. For example, in the opening of Poseidon, you are given a Bond moment for simply lasering through a grate, which you have to do to get out of the room anyways. However, shooting out the tires in Precious Cargo versus destroying the cars is a little trickier, and feels like an acknowledgement of going out of your way to do something. If I could, I'd make the Bond moments always be either extra things you have to go out of your way to do, or given for inventive solutions to problems, like using a gadget versus a gun, or finishing a level within a certain time frame. The 007 tokens only show up after you get the gold medal, and are needed to get the platinum. I can't decide if not counting them until you've collected them all is either a good thing or a bad thing. On the one hand, it encourages you to explore more, really comb through these levels. On the other hand, it can be frustrating if you simply can't find a token and decide to move on, only for all that time not to be acknowledged positively in the point total. I'm just not sure where I stand on this. Anywho, we then leave Romania and head to the South China Sea to investigate an oil rig linked to the Poseidon base. Fire and Water is probably what I consider to be the hardest level of the game, or at least hardest for me. There's a lot of people who can shoot at you from an elevated position, and there are a number of helicopters and grenadiers that make things harder. If I had to pick a least favorite level, this would be it. Yet I love how campy Nigel Block can get with all of his cackling. The level has a nice variety of locations, and I like the Q-jet and how it's used in progression. So it's not without its charms, and I certainly don't skip it. But up next is my absolute favorite level of the game, and thus one of my favorite levels in all of Bond. Forbidden Depths. It's honestly one of the simplest of the levels, on-rail shooting down a maglift tube until you defeat the clone block at the end. But the simplicity is part of the charm. Quite honestly, it's the visual splendor of the sequence, coupled with some of the best Bond music you will ever hear that gets me going. Remember earlier when I said I was holding off on listing the reason I love Streets of Bucharest? It's the music. GoldenEye for the N64 takes the cake for the best musical soundtrack of the Bond games, but Agent Under Fire is my number 2. It's the Tomorrow Never Dies of Bond games. There's probably a bit too much of the main theme throughout, but because the films over the last 20 years have been musically starved from too little usage of it, I'm primed for some good old-fashioned, full-throttle action Bond theme. This game has so many versions, and I get a smile on my face during 70% of them. I'm a big proponent of how the right music choice will make all the difference in a project, and if you were to watch me play this game in real time, you'd see the biggest grin on my face at several points throughout. Nothing makes me feel more like Bond than when that theme plays at just the right time, and I become 11 years old again during the second half of this level. Sure, it's a lot of cheese, but I don't care. It's the right kind of dopamine hit I need with the series. After defeating the clone block, you then head to the Poseidon cloning base. This has some of the most atmospheric level design of the game, with windows showing you the bottom of the ocean floor and frozen human bodies in tubes. I also love how this level acknowledges that Bond was unlikely to bring explosives with him during this investigation, thus allowing for an inventive use of gadgets. EA's Bond games always kept the gadgets in mind during its gameplay, as they knew the tech is part of the Bond fantasy. This game relies primarily on its phone for gadgets, like a lot of the Craig games would do as well. However, Agent Under Fire decks the phone out, and it's the center of Bond's toolset. It's not terribly realistic for a single gadget to be a Swiss Army knife, but who cares? It's part of the fun of classic Bond. My favorite gadget of all time is the Tomorrow Never Dies cell phone, partly because it's a powerhouse with multiple uses, and that's also true here. Notably, Poseidon features 2 different endings. For a long time, I always got the knockout gas ending because I didn't know about this key card you can pick up earlier. And I remember as a kid being disappointed that there was never a moment where Bond got together with Zoe. Turns out there was, and I just missed it. Though I didn't discover this until an embarrassing amount of time later. In my defense, the area where you pick it up puts all the focus on a button you can push to get an edge up on some tough enemies, and I was more focused on dispatching them than I was exploring. Or, just looking at the computer desks. Thus, the penultimate level has 2 possible beginning areas. I wish the idea of your actions affecting later levels or sections was used at least once more during the game. Say, for example, in Night of the Jackal. Dr. Demescu is killed because you took too long to find her, and then the next level would have you chase down some cars to get the data chip back rather than searching for it yourself. Oh well. At least the idea will come back in the next 2 games. Mediterranean Crisis is like Fire and Water, where I feel the difficulty is a bit tougher, but it's an awful lot of fun in places, particularly with certain Bond moves like using the Harrier jet engines to kill some guards, or setting off a missile to take out some poor chap. It's a pretty sprawling level and one of the longer ones to my mind. The final level, Evil Summit, takes you back to the Swiss Alps, though on a different side of Malprave's Peak. The opening area is one of the most memorable of the game for me for 2 reasons. First, if you've been diligent in getting the gold rewards up to this point, your P2K becomes a pretty powerful and accurate little weapon, and you can take out the 4 snipers relatively easily right at the start. When you get to the top of the towers to get the guards to come out, if you want, you can snipe them down with your pistol. Though they seem to be infinitely respawning at first, they will stop at a certain point, and thus you have quite the pool of ammunition to get. Second, you get a Bond move for getting the control program for the door with your Q remote. Here's a little glitch that I shamelessly used as a kid. You can get infinite Bond moves by continually hitting the action button with your Q remote pointed at the panel. This adds a lot to your final score, thus securing you your gold medal with ease. The next part of the level has you rescue the G8 leaders. Once again, this is some great and memorable set design, with the centerpiece in the first room that you can cut down to achieve a Bond move, and the offshoot silos. I do love that each silo is laid out a little differently, requiring you to take a slightly different approach to rescuing each leader. I do concur with Calvin Dyson. It bugs me that the last leader is the US President and not the British Prime Minister. That just feels wrong somehow for a Bond game. The final showdown is surprisingly not with Malprave, but with Block. I've always wondered if the developers felt a little iffy about Bond shooting women in their games, as the prominent female henchmen in 3 subsequent games all died by something other than gunshots. I don't know, I could be reading too much into it. The battle with Block can go on quite a while, and I hope you've been diligent in getting ammunition. Eventually, Block decides to randomly create a ramp for you and escapes out into Malprave's office. I've died at least a few times trying to get onto this ramp, as the jumping mechanic with the Q-jet can easily propel you past where you need to go. Once you get out to the office, you shoot Block once with a rocket launcher, and then you're done. Block's second death is a visually cool bit and leads to perhaps the best shot of the game. Malprave dies in the explosion a bit anticlimactically, and Bond lands on Zoe's Harrier jet and they fly off into the credits. Or rather, a 13-minute long video montage showing you how to get pretty much all the Bond moments. It's a bit of a shame you only get this at the end of the level and you can't replay it any other way. It's a nice reward for beating the game, but personally, I'd have rather had a behind-the-scenes featurette like we get in the next 2 games. So that's the Agent Under Fire campaign. Despite a pretty short and thin story and a few questionable plot points, I think it's a great time. The levels are nicely varied in design, each has its own unique vibe, they're generally about the right length, though you have a couple of major exceptions, but truly, there's not a single level I despise or sigh about playing through again. Each has its moments, with some being true standouts of the series. And the upside about the game being on the shorter side means it's not too much of a proposition to replay the levels multiple times to get those high scores. Generally, I like to play on the operative difficulty as I love the power fantasy, but I have played the entire game on 00 Agent before. For this review, I played on the Agent setting just to make it a little more interesting. The AI is pretty aggressive to the point of stupidity, but it does make you stay on your toes and thus rarely results in a lull. On this playthrough, I played the game using a third-party wireless GameCube controller on a 55-inch 4K TV through original hardware, and there were 2 hindrances from the setup for me. First, you can't really change the lighting settings in the game, so some areas seemed a lot darker than I remember them being. I could have changed this in the TV settings, but I was worried I'd forget to change it back for my wife when she watched her shows. So if it looks like I'm missing my targets a lot in the footage, that's part of the reason. The other hindrance was that the controls were a lot more sensitive and slippery than I remember. Just a tap of the control stick made the aiming reticule go farther than I wanted, and Bond would be prone sometimes to falling off of narrow ledges and areas. I do remember it being a little slick in the original version, but I did wonder if it was somewhat exacerbated by the wireless controller. To my knowledge, you can only really change the sensitivity for the multiplayer, and I would have greatly appreciated that here in the campaign. If they ever do a remaster or a re-release of the game, that's a quality of life addition I'd love to have. Speaking of multiplayer, I owned the GameCube version growing up, so I had access to AI bots, which is a feature that apparently the original PS2 version doesn't have. That's a shame, because this is a solid offering, and I'd hate to think that people missed out on this. It's got a good variety of maps, it's pretty fast-paced, you have a plethora of options to play with, like the weapon loadouts and the optional gadgets to use, and a decent character roster. It is missing a few classic characters to play with, making Agent Under Fire one of the few Bond multiplayers that doesn't have this option. The aggressive bot AI does make it so that even the medium difficulty ones were a bit tougher than I'd like. Still, there's a good amount of fun to go around. It's not quite as good as GoldenEye or Nightfire, but I have some good memories with this. My favorite map was always the town. When you play this with the Q-Claw, it's a blast. The gadgets work here a little differently than in the campaign. The Q-Jet reloads by itself, and the Q-Claw can attach to any surface, which makes some matches truly chaotic. Add to that some unique weapons like the Pulse Cannon, and you can easily get a few good matches going here. In a somewhat unique move, this game features none of the likenesses or voices from the film actors. Everyone is more emulating the feel of the traditional characters versus trying to be any one version. With the exception of M, voiced by a returning Karen Pascoe, who is clearly voice modeled after Judi Dench. R is played by Miles Anderson, who played Q in the Tomorrow Never Dies game, a welcome return. Bond is played by Andrew Bicknell, who contributed a small part in Tomorrow Never Dies. At first, I felt the character model was a reworked Pierce Brosnan skin, but I've come around to the idea of this being a fairly generic version, with a personality that's more based on Roger Moore than anything. In an interview with Mark Edlitz, Bicknell voiced his opinion that the character's looks weren't based on him, and I'm inclined to believe that, as he likely would have had to sign away his likeness for the project, and I think he'd remember doing that. I actually embrace the idea of having a video game-specific Bond versus trying to cast one of the film actors, as when you do that, you'll be expected to model the character and tone of your game after what the actor did in the films. And some of the actors' takes just don't lend themselves well to modern video games. But if you have a unique version disconnected from the films, you have more freedom to craft a unique vision for your Bond game. Agent Under Fire holds a very special place in my heart. It's certainly not the first Bond game I ever played or owned, but it was the first I got after becoming a fan, and for a while this was the only Bond game I had for the GameCube. So it was common practice for me after I watched a Bond film to pop this in for an hour and continue the fun. I'm very aware of my biases here. When compared with a lot of the other games, Agent Under Fire doesn't hold a candle, and there's a lot of places for improvement before it can claim the crown of the definitive Bond video game experience. At the time of this recording, 007 First Light is still a few months away from being released, so I could be eating my words in a bit. But I don't feel like we've gotten the equivalent of Batman Arkham Asylum for James Bond, a game that's fun to play, has a great story that holds up on its own, and appropriately makes you feel like Bond from the word go. We've gotten close a few times, with Everything or Nothing being my top contender for that. But I feel my perfect Bond game would be an amalgamation of Everything or Nothing, N64 GoldenEye, and Agent Under Fire. What I hope future games take from this is the variety of gameplay styles and making them all equally fun to play, as well as embracing the bombastic side of the character. I don't mind if you want to do something more thought out and layered with the story, but my ideal Bond video game adventure should have great unrestrained set pieces with blaring Bond themes. When I want explosive tongue-in-cheek Bond, Agent Under Fire is where I go, and I'm never disappointed. James Bond as a series is like pizza to me. Even the worst and most shallow entries give me something I enjoy wholeheartedly. Agent Under Fire is definitely the shallow game when it comes to the story, but when it comes to the action, there are few that best it. Being the first Bond game for the 6th generation and being released only a few years after GoldenEye, the game did some strong sales considering its pedigree, and is remembered fondly amongst a lot of Bond fans. While the critics might not have agreed, I'm glad that the developers weren't deterred and they continued to push the boundaries of what Bond games could do. With the 40th anniversary of the films being imminent, and the 20th Bond film posed to celebrate this accomplishment, it only made sense to try to have a game on the shelves at the same time. Like Agent Under Fire, it would feature an original story with first-person shooter action, on-rails, and driving sections, and a robust suite of multiplayer options. However, unlike Agent Under Fire, EA would go all out to make Nightfire feel like one of the films, complete with a gun barrel, a pre-title sequence, an opening song, and even securing the likeness of the current James Bond, Pierce Brosnan. And for some, this resulted in the finest James Bond video game experience ever created.